Let's get straight into things and take a look at your perspective on the summit that's currently underway. Are we potentially looking at just another talk shop here?
I wouldn't be so harsh and say it's just a talk shop, but it's definitely a meeting where I wouldn't expect very specific results to come from.
Looking at it, I mean, let's go into some of the rationale as to why that bar is being set low from your end.
It is very much a summit culture, so I think we shouldn't overburden 5 heads of state sitting together with a very, very detailed plan of action that they should come up with. Either that work has been done beforehand, and you do have a work plan that you sign off on and that you agree on little last details that you have to change, or you will have a very general statement. And in the last summits, from what I have seen, it was rather a general statement, intentions, areas that you want to take forward. It is pushing the right buttons in the statements, but in terms of what you do with it, that really happens on the ground, and that won't happen at summits. So my expectation isn't in a negative way. I just try to manage my expectations to not be disappointed afterwards.
Sven, you did say that in your report, in a comment that you wrote, you were saying that if the BRICS want to become more meaningful, they should establish mechanisms that go beyond the fireplace talks and get working groups together on issues. Just tell us a little bit more about what you would like them to see that would come up with concrete issues and for them to move forward as a body.
I think what we see at the moment with the BRICS is very much a summit culture as we've seen in the G7, G8. That is harshly criticized within the G7 and G8 as a big media event, meaningless in terms of substance, and there should be more in terms of substance from those meetings. I think what the BRICS could do is move more towards what the OECD is doing. That is an international organization, and the BRICS aren't, so it's a long way. Sorry, it's a long way. But in the OECD, you would see comparative studies, for instance, on the education sector. You would see comparative studies on how economic growth is happening and what the banking sector looks like. And these areas and comparisons between countries, and if you want a peer review between countries, would very likely be adding substance and adding bigger debates in sectors and policy areas in specific fields on what you can improve, what needs to be improved in countries, and actually do what the BRICS want to be doing, which is mutual learning.
What do you see being the biggest challenge in actually hindering progress down this avenue, Sven? Is it just a matter of this being a new entity and a new body that's still getting its workings underway, or do you read more into it?
Well, it's definitely a new body, and we should be managing, as I say, managing the expectations. But I think there's also more profound tensions within the BRICS. I am not so certain how much transparency Russia or China want on certain issues. I do see very different views on certain policy areas within the BRICS, which to some degree is natural, to some degree that is what you have in the G7 as well, but it might be a bit more pronounced given the structure of the grouping.
Sven, I want to ask you a little bit about leadership in the IMF and the World Bank, and that has been an issue, and we have seen Africa, saying they would like to see somebody from the African continent go into one of those positions. Traditionally, it has been either coming from Europe or from the United States. Just speak to us a little bit about whether there is agreement between the BRICS countries in terms of how they look at this and whether they would like to be involved. We know, as I've said, that Africa would like to be. Just talk to us a little bit about that and some of the debate that you think should be going on.
That was my disappointment with the IMF chair, because that chair was actually, it was foreseeable that there was a change in the chair, and it would have been a very nice way of the BRICS to stamp their feet on the ground, if you want, and come up with a joint candidate in Sanya, and there wasn't a meeting, there wasn't a discussion on that. When Strauss-Kahn had to resign, there wasn't even an ad hoc coordination, which I thought was a pity. For the World Bank, there has been an explicit statement from India saying there won't be a joint BRICS candidate. It would have been very nice for the BRICS to join behind one or the other candidate, and why not the African candidate? The key problem I would see there is actually, in that case, really different interests. The Chinese side, for instance, is very much in a mode of not rocking the boat, not trying to shake up the order, but actually get into that order and get a more important position in that world order. So it's not revolution but evolution that the Chinese are preaching, and that's quite ironic actually. But in that context, it's much less of a stirring up of a fight, but more move your staff, move your nationals up in the ladder in these institutions.
Sven, I want to come in there.
If you come up with a joint candidate, I think the only person or the only countries that could bring up a joint candidate that would be acceptable to those who hold the majority in those institutions would actually be either Brazil or South Africa for various reasons.
Sven, I want to ask you, because it seems, I mean, reading your comment and then and listening to what you're saying now, it seems as though the countries seem to have different agendas.
Which is normal to some degree. As I said, you have that in the G7 as well. It is a meeting to discuss differences and to search for common ground and to push for the common ground, as you would do as wise diplomats, rather than pushing on the differences. There are areas where the BRICS will not be able to move and where we will not see any joint action in the foreseeable future. And I can regret that personally. But I think it is a fact of life that it won't be an agreement in all areas very soon.
Sven, within that context, I mean, South Africa's voice and muscle, most particularly, has come under extreme scrutiny, and there have been numerous questions about our role and effectiveness within this entity at large. I mean, what's your role, what's our role as South Africa, as you see it, within this BRICS grouping?
It's a very difficult role, actually. It is by far the smallest member, it's by far the smallest economy. And it actually is being in this group as a representative of a whole continent that in not all quarters wants to be represented by South Africa. It's not an enviable position. I think so far the country is doing quite well. If that discussion about a development bank is taking shape, maybe that is a very interesting point for South Africa to pick up and suggest that there could be some more movements towards the rest of the continent. South African foreign policy is about South Africa in the first place, but it is very well advised to follow on an African agenda, and that is what the government is stating most of the time, and that is what it should pursue.
Certainly what is being pursued as well is increased trade activity between the BRICS nations and Africa, increased foreign direct investments. We've had very ambitious targets being set. I mean, trade projected to rise from $150 billion in 2010 to $350 billion in 2015. FDI forecast to increase from $60 billion in 2009 to more than $150 billion in 2015. With this being the dilemma that a nation like South Africa sits with right now within this entity, just how much clout do you see South Africa having in terms of negotiating terms of deals being struck?
It only has clout if it sits as the representative of Africa in this round. Africa does have 1 billion inhabitants, and there is a growth market actually in Africa that does make countries like China, like India, but increasingly also Europe and Africa interested in African markets. If that is something that is advocated and is tapped into, that is actually a classical example of South Africa as per usual since the mid-1990s punching above its weight, which is a good development in that case. But as I say, it puts some tension on South Africa to negotiate on behalf of other countries with varying agendas. The goals are very ambitious. I'm not so sure that much of the results will be through the BRICS. The trade between China and Africa will happen whether we have a BRICS summit or not, as there is a very clear interest in China in the markets and in the resources of Africa. There is a change in economic policy in China, which is focusing more on domestic consumption now. That might mean that there is a little less eagerness, a little less aggressiveness in the markets, in market intrusion, if you want, in market conquering in Africa. But at the same time, we still have growth rates of 7, 8, 9%, which should not get Africa too worried. The key worry that I would have is what does Africa make with that? And what does it make out of the investments? And how does it benefit from the investment? How does it make investments benefit the peoples?